You are healing. We pray for peace for all who need it, for all of us, and for this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Many of us have experienced losses that seem unbearable at the time. Whether it was the death of a loved one or the death of a dream, it's a human experience to wonder how on earth we are going to go on after a devastating loss. Our scripture this morning is the beginning of a letter to a community that is experiencing a great loss. The remaining Jewish kingdom, Judah, has been captured by the Babylonians. They sent the king and all of the elites into exile into Babylon. And eventually Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and very few Jews were left in what had been Judah. They were all in exile in Babylon. A few chapters back, God spoke through Jeremiah, our prophet, to warn the Jews that they were starting to stray from their purpose as God's people. These were the same people God had delivered from slavery and oppression through the Exodus. And they were starting to forget that their faith and their religious practices were meant to be rooted in the love that saved them and the liberation that they experienced through God's grace. Jeremiah warned them as a prophet that if this was not the central tenet of their religious practice, destruction would be ahead. And so it was. In our text today, God is again speaking through Jeremiah in this letter. And God tells the Jews to settle into exile for the long haul. This is not a welcome message to them. And indeed, there was a rival prophet named Hananiah who predicted that the exile would soon be over and the Jews would all be back to the temple. But unfortunately, Jeremiah was the one who was right. And here's the thing. The entire Jewish faith was oriented to this promised land where they lived, Palestine now, where Moses had led them. And that entire faith was also oriented to the temple in Jerusalem that held the tabernacle, that was the presence of God to them. So this exile from their promised land, from their temple, and the eventual destruction of it was an excruciating blow to them. How could they continue to practice their faith away from their promised land and their temple? Have you ever heard the reggae song that asks, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? I love that song. That's from Psalm 137, and this is exactly the time period that song is talking about. How can we sing the Lord's song when we're not in our land? We're in a strange land. I cannot imagine the grief of being exiled from your home and the place that is the center of your religion. I can't imagine being told to seek the peace and the prosperity of the land to which you are exiled when it is the land of those who took yours away. I can't imagine how it felt to try to remake the rituals of faith in a strange place without a temple. Even though God, through Jeremiah, tells the Jews to build houses and plant gardens and get married and pray for the peace and prosperity of the land, what God doesn't mean is for the Jews to become like the Babylonians. And this is the hard part. God doesn't mean for the Jews to worship the Babylonian gods or engage in their culture. Rather, they are supposed to use their time in exile to reground themselves in their own faith. They have to get back to being the living, loving, radical community that they were. They have to get back to being this liberation-oriented community that God had called them to be. They had to distinguish themselves from the Babylonians and their gods and their values. I think we're in a similar situation in these days, right now in the United States. It's really hard not to absorb the values of the culture around us. They teach us that money is the most important thing. They teach us that we can't afford to feed people or welcome immigrants or provide housing for everyone. The values of the culture around us are around scarcity and also great wealth in ways that make no sense at all to justice. And those values teach us that it's more important to be nice and to go along with the status quo than it is to speak up for justice. One example of that really stands out for me. It was a big social media blow up this week. I'm sure many of you saw the dust up about Ellen DeGeneres and George W. Bush, yes? They were at a football game together. There's a picture or a video of them laughing and chatting, and people criticized Ellen for being friendly with a person who actively worked to harm the LGBTQ community and who began a war that resulted in thousands and thousands of people's deaths. And honestly, if the picture or the video had been it, I might not have thought much about it. To my own shame, I do understand that society sometimes pressures us to be nice to people who have caused harm to our community or to other communities. But Ellen went on to defend herself in the opening monologue of her show, and one line that she said just tore me up. She said, "Just because I don't agree with someone on everything doesn't mean I'm not going to be friends with them." And that sounds good, right? We can agree to disagree. We can be friends with people we disagree with. We can get along. But as my friend Jay said, a disagreement is whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Z thinks it does. I don't, but whatever. But a disagreement is not whether or not every human deserves the same rights to employment and housing security regardless of their sexual orientation. There's a quote that's incorrectly attributed to James Baldwin that also makes the rounds of social media. It says, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and the denial of my humanity and right to exist. Yeah. It's actually by somebody named Robert Jones Jr., but his social media handle is Son of Baldwin, so somehow it's been misattributed to James Baldwin. During this week, when our rights were being debated at the Supreme Court, when the court was hearing 3 cases about whether LGBTQ people could be fired for being who we are, it worked my last queer nerve to see this person, this privileged gay person, defending someone who also wanted to ensure that we didn't have equal rights. I couldn't deal. I was so angry. I definitely spoke out on social media. Yeah, but let me be truthful. I have thought all week about the hypocrisy of my stance. I've thought all week about the many times I haven't protested a racist or sexist comment in a social setting where I didn't think I had the power to do so. I've thought about what I would have done in Ellen's place. Would I have snubbed a former president? Would I have engaged him in conversation about my LGBTQ community or the Iraq War? I mean, I'd like to think that I would do that, but I don't know. I know what that pressure feels like. So let's go back to those Jews in exile in Babylon. Just like us, it's not easy to live an alternate reality and maintain our grounding in faith. It's far easier just to go along with the status quo and with whatever's happening around us and just be nice. It's far easier. Professor Bernard W. Anderson says about the Jews in exile, it's phenomenal that the faith of Israel was preserved with great purity and zeal in the Babylonian exile. Those folks did it. They didn't just go along to get along. The Jews lived in Babylon, they married, they planted, they ate, they prayed, and they managed to return to the values of their religion: love, caring, liberation. They did not succumb to the cultural pressure of living in Babylon. And this is the faith we inherited, my friends. One that survives and adapts to loss, that challenges the status quo, and that reminds us that we can't spend our time looking back and longing for what used to be, even when what used to be is our temple and our homeland. Rather, we have to figure out how to worship God now in a way that makes sense for this time and this place, in this world, in this moment of history. God is calling us to settle in, but not to be overcome by the misguided values around us. We can proclaim God's love for all people, including immigrants, including LGBTQ people. We can work to change the systems that keep us from having food and housing and health care available to everyone in this, the richest country on the planet. We can work to recognize and change the white supremacy that harms all of us. Our faith proclaims a God of love and liberation, and that is countercultural. And just like our ancestors who were in exile in Babylon, we too can preserve that liberating faith right here in 2019 in South Florida. Amen.